shot like fish in a barrel, were subjected to a merciless bombardment for 22, 23 days. 1,400 Palestinians were killed. 1,400 Palestinians were killed, the vast majority of them women and children. Thousands were maimed and orphaned. Hundreds had to have a limb amputated. Scores had to have 2 limbs amputated. And dozens, believe it or not, had to have 3 limbs amputated. And they don't even have wheelchairs in Gaza to be pushed around. This massacre that we saw, as long as we didn't have to depend on Fox News or Sky News or the Bush and Blair Corporation of what used to be the BBC, we were able, if we had access to Al Jazeera, to Press TV, for which I present 2 programs every week, if we had access to the internet, to YouTube, we saw the crimes that were committed, and we listened for a word from the world to try to bring it to a halt, and we listened in vain. But instead of sitting at home crying, though crying was necessary, instead of our hearts merely bleeding, millions of us around the world took to the streets and marched in protest at this great crime, here in New York, in London, and around the world. In London, on the 10th of January, 100,000 people in the land of Balfour marched on the Israeli embassy in Kensington. Day after day, night after night, we besieged that embassy, as many others did around the world. And we saw those crimes in bloody technicolor on our screens. Let me tell you about white phosphorus. We saw the white phosphorus gas being dropped on a civilian population that had been locked up. Imagine something calling itself, though we don't accept it, the Jewish state, dropping gas on civilians. Dropping gas on the United Nations in Gaza. We saw the pictures, don't deny it. We saw the pictures of the gas falling on United Nations schools and warehouses, clinics. We saw the United Nations drivers murdered on their way to deliver food and medicine to the victims of this aggression. The United Nations had an inquiry into this series of crimes. They concluded that Israel was guilty of war crimes. And the President of Israel himself, Shimon Peres, the President of the state, announced to the United Nations, and I quote, that Israel does not accept one single word of this report. I'm asking, here in New York, how come Israel is allowed to continue to be a member of the United Nations when it defies every decision that the United Nations makes? I know about white phosphorus. I happened to be in Beirut with Arafat when Israel began its invasion of Lebanon in 1982. I was in Beirut when Israel was reducing an Arab capital to rubble and ash, to silence, the same silence from the governments of the world, except from Gaddafi. Gaddafi ordered Arafat to commit suicide for allowing Israel to enter West Beirut. Arafat answered, if the Arab armies would come to our rescue, nobody would have to commit suicide here in West Beirut. I went to the hospitals. I saw the children, victims of white phosphorus, the first time Israel used it. I saw the white smoke coming from their noses and their mouths as they cooked to death inside. That's what happens when you breathe this white phosphorus. You can't breathe it out until you're dead, until you have baked to death from the inside. We saw that little girl, if we had Al Jazeera, 3 years old, like the little child I had on my knee just a few minutes ago, held up to the camera, her face blackened by flames, having laid out dead for 3 days in Zaytuna on the edge of Gaza City. The cameraman held her up, dead, minus her arm and her leg, which had been eaten by the dogs that were roaming the rubble of Gaza in the killing fields of those days. We read the report in the English Guardian of the baby that was found dead, still suckling on the toe of her dead mother. Keep that image in your mind. A dead baby suckling on the toe of her dead mother. The next time you hear some Brooklyn accented barbarian as a spokesman for Israel on television telling you that they're the only democracy in the Middle East. What kind of democracy is it that murders children and gasses civilians, having locked them up for the duration? And we saw the little girl, aged 10, keep that in your mind, standing in the rubble of her house, one of the 61,200 Palestinian houses that were destroyed in 22 days. I don't know how many houses there are in Brooklyn, but just imagine going out tonight and finding 61,200 houses had been destroyed by aerial bombardment. This little girl had been staying with her grandmother, and when she heard that her house had been bombed, they went there to discover that her mother and her father and all 5 of her brothers had all been killed by these bombs. I interviewed this little girl just a few weeks ago, standing in the rubble, and she said something to me which broke my heart, and I have to say it to you. She asked me this: where is this Arab world that they teach us about in school? Where is this Ummah that they teach us about in the mosque? Why did they leave us alone? She said, tears running down her face. Why did they leave us alone to face this? What did we do to deserve this? She repeated it, but a second time to the back of my head, because I could not look upon her face, for I had no answer to the questions that she was asking. But I'll tell you something. I promised her that I would be her father, I would be her brother, and I would find thousands of people who would be her brothers and the brothers of all who had been left alone. On the 10th of January, as I marched with the 100,000 in London to the embassy, the snow was falling, darkness too, and I was thinking about what I was going to say at the rally at the end of the demonstration. And I decided that the time had come to declare that action speaks louder than words, that tears, however heartfelt, were easy to shed, and that we had to do something rather than merely speak or listen. And so I announced that 4 weeks later I would lead a massive British convoy all the way from London to Gaza to break the siege and to bring aid to the suffering Palestinian people there.